The first thing everyone saw was the dust, not the man standing near the open storage unit with a folded auction receipt in his hand. Not the little boy beside him, wearing a faded navy baseball cap that was too big for his head. Not the way the man's eyes had stopped moving the second the roll-up door hit the ceiling. Just dust, broken boxes, cracked plastic tubs, a busted shop fan, old tires, and the kind of forgotten mess people only looked at when they were hoping to laugh. Then, Vanessa Sterling laughed loud enough for the whole row of storage units to hear. She stood in cream-colored heels on the hot concrete, a black suit jacket hanging perfectly on her shoulders, her assistant holding a tablet behind her like the whole morning had been scheduled for her amusement. "He paid $250 for this?" she said, turning just enough so the other buyers could hear. "Some men really will buy anything if it's cheap enough." A few people chuckled because Vanessa Sterling was the kind of woman people laughed with even when they did not find something funny. She was the CEO of Sterling Heritage Motor Group, the woman who bought forgotten cars from estates, polished their stories, and sold them to wealthy men who wanted history with leather seats. She had come to the lien auction expecting old memorabilia. Maybe a tool chest, maybe something she could place in one of her high-end showrooms. Instead, the storage manager had called the next number, and Ethan Cole, a 39-year-old single father with grease under one thumbnail and a grocery store pen tucked behind his ear, had won the unit for $250. Vanessa looked him over the way people look over a dent on a car door. "I hope your kid likes scrap metal," she added, "because that is all you just bought." Ethan said nothing. He did not lower his head, and he did not answer back. He only folded the receipt once and slipped it into the front pocket of his worn gray work shirt. Beside him, 9-year-old Owen Cole reached up and touched the brim of the old Navy cap he always wore when he felt nervous. The cap had belonged to his mother, Hannah. Inside the brim was a small black and white checkered patch she had sewn there. After one of the local races she and Ethan used to attend before hospital rooms and unpaid bills became the center of their lives. Owen looked into the unit, then up at his father. "Dad," he whispered, careful not to let Vanessa hear the crack in his voice, "did we just buy trash?" That question landed harder than the laugh. Ethan turned toward his son and almost answered right away. But something at the back of the unit caught his eye. It was buried behind a collapsed shelf and half covered by an oil-stained tarp. Too heavy to have been moved casually and too awkward to be ordinary furniture. Most people would have seen only a dirty lump of metal, the kind of thing that would cost more to haul away than it was worth. Ethan stepped over a torn cardboard box, crouched down, and pulled the tarp back just enough to expose the corner of an engine block. The metal was dull and oxidized, one valve cover black and peeling. Hoses dry as old rope. Vanessa called from behind him, "Careful, Mr. 250. That junk might fall apart before you can sell it." Ethan did not look back. His fingers moved across the bell housing flange. Slow and careful, wiping away grime with the side of his thumb, there, almost hidden beneath years of dust, were hand-stamped characters pressed unevenly into the metal. HC 358D3. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. His eyes moved from the stamp to a strange weld near the water crossover, a clean little scar made by someone who knew what they were doing and did not care whether anyone else ever noticed. He leaned closer, not because he doubted what he saw, but because he remembered where he had seen it before. Vanessa's smile faded just a little when the mechanic, who was supposed to be embarrassed, did not act embarrassed. Owen stepped closer. Ethan covered the stamp, again with the tarp, and said quietly, "No, buddy, someone hid this. Before we go deeper, if you have ever been judged by the clothes you wore, the car you drove, or the money people thought you had, stay with this story. Tell me where you are listening from today, because this one is for the quiet people who see value before the world gives them permission to see it." Marisol Vega, the storage facility manager, walked over with a clipboard and a yellow vest that had seen too many Arizona summers. "Mr. Cole," she said, "you have 48 hours to clear the unit. You paid, I signed, and the lien packet is complete. Anything inside is yours, unless law enforcement flags it, and nothing here was flagged." She said it politely, but with enough volume for Vanessa and the other buyers to hear. Ethan nodded and asked for a copy of every page. Vanessa gave a small, sharp smile. "You'll need more than paperwork to turn rust into rent money," she said. Then she looked at Owen, at the faded cap, and at the father trying not to react. Maybe next time, let the adults bid on things that matter. That was the moment Owen looked away. Not because he understood storage auctions or race engines, or the cruel arithmetic of rich people laughing at poor ones. He looked away because children know when an adult is trying to make their parent smaller. Ethan saw it and felt the old anger rise, the kind he had trained himself to swallow since Hannah died in 2021 and left him with a little boy, medical debt, and a house that always seemed one broken appliance away from falling apart. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell Vanessa that money did not make her eyes sharper, that a clean suit did not mean a clean judgment, that some of the best machines in the world had been saved by men with cracked hands. Instead, he picked up a broken hand truck from inside the unit and said to Owen, "We work first, we talk later." By noon, the storage unit was no longer a joke to Ethan. It was a problem, a puzzle, and maybe the first real break he had seen in years. Under the collapsed shelf, he found old racing magazines, 2 cracked plastic bins filled with fittings, a dry sump oil tank wrapped in a moving blanket, and a narrow cardboard box full of yellowed papers that had been shoved behind a metal cabinet. He loaded carefully, keeping the engine last, refusing help from a man who offered to drag it out with a chain. "It's not scrap," Ethan said, and his tone was quiet enough that only Owen heard it. Vanessa was gone by then, but one of her assistants had stayed near the gate, pretending to check messages while taking photos of the Unit's contents. Ethan noticed. He always noticed the small things. The garage where Ethan worked was called Danner S. Auto Repair, a low building on the edge of a sun-baked industrial strip in the Phoenix suburbs. It was not pretty, but it was honest. The sign buzzed at night, the coffee was bad, and the office chair had tape on one arm. But Russ Danner had given Ethan steady hours when other shops had looked at his years away from motorsport and decided he came with too much personal history. Russ let Ethan use the far bay after closing if he paid a little extra toward electricity and kept customer cars moving that evening. Ethan backed a borrowed trailer into the side lot, while Owen sat on the curb with Hannah's old cap pulled low over his eyebrows. The boy had not asked again whether they had bought trash. That made it worse. When the engine finally sat in the far bay under clean shop lights, it looked both sad and dangerous, like an animal that had been caged too long. Ethan did not try to start it. He did not even turn it over. He walked around it with a flashlight, checking what was present, what was missing, and what should not be touched until he knew more. The custom manifold had a strange asymmetry that made his chest tighten with memory. The dry sump pan carried a bent aluminum tag, almost torn loose. One valve cover had been swapped, but the left one still had the dull black coating he remembered from development units. "Not customer engines." Owen climbed onto a rolling stool. "How do you know it?" "S special," he asked. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. "I didn't know yet," he said, "but I know it is what she said it was." That was the closest Ethan came to making a promise. He had learned not to promise too much. After Hannah got sick, he had promised Owen she would come home from the hospital. And then he had stood in a hallway under fluorescent lights with a doctor speaking softly and understood that good men could still be wrong. Since then, he spoke carefully. He made sandwiches, packed lunches, fixed brakes, paid what he could, and kept moving. But the engine sitting in that bay had reached into a part of him he had buried when he left Halbrook Corwin 12 years earlier. Back then he had been young, fast with numbers, faster with sound, a development technician in a dyno room where engines screamed behind glass and men argued over data until sunrise. He had walked away when Hannah needed him. He had never regretted the choice, only the way the world forgot he had ever been more than the tired mechanic at Bay 4, inside the cardboard box. The first layer was disappointing. Old receipts, manuals for tools that were no longer there, a racing calendar from 2003, and photographs so faded they looked like ghosts. Then Ethan found a folder wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. He opened it gently and saw dyno sheets, handwritten notes, and a Polaroid showing an engine on a stand under bright shop lights. He held the photo closer. The valve cover was the same black coating. The manifold leaned the same wrong way. On the side of the block, almost out of focus, was the same crooked hand stamp. Owen watched his father's face change. "Is that it?" he asked. Ethan nodded once. Slowly, it might be. The first small silence happened on a video call at 9:17 that night. Ethan had sent 3 photos to Cal Mercer, a man he had not spoken to in almost 4 years. Cal had been a data assistant at Hallbrook Corwin, younger than Ethan then, and older than he wanted to admit now. He answered from a kitchen somewhere in Nevada, gray beard, tired eyes. Baseball game muted on a television behind him. "Ethan Cole," Cal said. "You only call when something is broken or haunted." Ethan did not laugh. He held the phone over the engine, moved the light to the hand stamp, then to the TIG repair near the water crossover. "Tell me I'm wrong," Ethan said. Cal leaned toward the screen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For almost 10 seconds, Cal just stared. The shop seemed to go quiet around Ethan, even though the compressor kicked once in the corner and traffic hummed beyond the roll-up door. Owen looked from the phone to his father and understood, in a child's way, that grown men did not fall silent over ordinary junk. Cal finally whispered, "Where did you get that?" Ethan told him about the storage auction, the $250, the unit, the old paperwork. Cal rubbed his face with both hands. "If that stamp is real, and if those sheets match. Keep everyone away from it. Don't clean too much. Don't paint. Don't start it. Don't let some rich idiot call it incomplete and buy it cheap." Ethan looked toward the office window, where Russ was counting receipts. "Too late for the rich idiot part," he said. Cal asked for photos of the folder, the dry sump tag, the left valve cover, and the back of every Polaroid. Ethan sent them while Owen ate a vending machine granola bar for dinner, because neither of them had the energy to drive home yet. 10 minutes later, Cal called back, and his voice had changed from curiosity to warning. "There was a historian," he said. "Leonard Pike. He archived half the Apex GT development program after it collapsed. If anyone can tell you what you have, it's him. But listen to me. Ethan, if Sterling Heritage finds out before you secure the paperwork, they'll try to make the story about ownership, chain of custody, safety, anything but the truth." Ethan looked at the folder on the workbench. "Vanessa Sterling was at the auction," he said. Cal closed his eyes. Of course she was. The next morning, the humiliation had already traveled farther than Ethan expected. A short clip appeared on Sterling Heritage Motor Group's social page. Edited like a joke, it showed Ethan standing beside the open unit, Owen in the navy cap, Vanessa laughing, and the caption, "Some storage finds are treasure, some are lessons." By the time Ethan arrived at Danner S., 2 customers had seen it. One asked if he was starting a junk museum. Another said his kid looked like he wanted to disappear. Ethan kept his face still, but Owen heard the second comment from the office. The boy took off Hannah's cap and held it in his lap with both hands, pressing the checkered patch between his fingers. Ethan walked over, knelt in front of him, and said, "You don't have to wear it if today feels too loud." Owen shook his head and put it back on. "Mom wore it when people were loud," he said. That afternoon, Vanessa Sterling stopped laughing and started moving. The first sign was an email forwarded from Marisol Vega. It came from a law firm representing Sterling Heritage Motor Group and requested a review of potential irregularities in the lien auction process involving Unit B41. The wording was polished, but the meaning was simple. Vanessa had realized she might have missed something. Ethan read it twice, then placed his receipt, lien sale confirmation, and facility paperwork into a folder of his own. Marisol called 5 minutes later. "Nervous but clear, Mr. Cole. I want you to know the sale was legal. The notices were sent, the waiting period passed, and you paid in full. I am not reversing anything because a CEO does like the outcome." Ethan thanked her. Then she lowered her voice. "But they asked if any hazardous automotive equipment was improperly released. You should be ready." By closing time, the pressure reached the garage. Russ Danner came into the far bay, holding his phone like it had bitten him. "Ethan," he said, "why is a lawyer asking whether I am storing unlicensed race equipment on my property?" Russ was not cruel, but he was tired, and tired men fear expensive letters. Ethan explained the auction, the paperwork, the engine, and the fact that nothing had been started, spilled, or dismantled. Russ listened, jaw tight. "I like you," he said. "You know that, but I can lose this place over somebody else's rich person fight." Ethan nodded because he had expected that too. "Give me 48 hours, he said. "I'll move it if I have to." Russ looked at Owen through the office glass, then back at Ethan. "You get until Friday morning. After that it can be here unless you have something in writing that protects my shop." That was not an insult, that was real. A deadline, a place at risk, a roof over the one part of Ethan's life where he still felt useful. Vanessa had found the soft spot, not in the engine, but around it. Ethan spent the evening documenting everything. He photographed the engine from every angle, placed the auction receipt beside the hand stamp in one shot, scanned the dyno sheets, numbered the Polaroids, and wrote down the time and place of removal from the storage unit. Owen sat nearby with a marker and labeled plain folders because it made him feel like he was helping. "Why does she want it now?" he asked. Ethan did not look up from the scanner. "Because she saw me look at it like it mattered. Owen thought about that, so she didn't know until you knew." Ethan smiled without humor. "That happens more often than people admit." Near midnight, Ethan sent the cleanest images to Cal, and Cal forwarded them to Leonard Pike with a short message that Ethan did not see. The shop was nearly dark except for the desk lamp over the paperwork and the white reflection of the engine under a plastic cover. Ethan drove Owen home in silence, through streets lined with closed tire shops and fast food signs. At a red light, Owen asked, "If it is worth something, does that make what she said not true?" Ethan looked at his son's reflection in the rearview mirror, the navy cap shadowing his eyes. "What she said was never true," he answered. "Money doesn't decide that." Owen nodded, but he was 9, and 9-year-olds need the world to prove what fathers say. The proof did not arrive cleanly. It arrived the next afternoon, after another email from Vanessa's lawyer, a second call to Russ, and a message from a local business account, joking about Ethan's famous trash unit. Ethan was under the lift replacing a customer's lower control arm when his phone buzzed 3 times on the workbench. He almost ignored it. Then he saw Cal's name and wiped his hands fast enough to leave grease across his wrist. The first message was only 2 words, "Check email." The second was a scanned archive note with the heading Holbrook Corwin Apex GT Development Inventory. The third was from a number Ethan did not know. He opened it while Owen stood beside him, holding the folder of auction papers against his chest. The message was short, written by someone who did not waste words. "This is Leonard Pike. Do not sell that engine. Do not start it. Do not let Sterling touch it. I am coming." Leonard Pike arrived the next morning in a white pickup with sun-faded paint, a leather satchel on the passenger seat, and the kind of silence that made people stop talking before he asked them to. He was 68, thin as a rail, with silver hair combed straight back and reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. Ethan had expected a man from the old racing world to arrive loud, carrying stories, maybe wearing a jacket full of patches. Leonard wore a plain blue shirt, old boots, and a watch with a cracked face. He shook Ethan's hand once, nodded to Owen, then looked past both of them at the covered engine in the far bay. "Show me exactly how you found it," he said, "and don't leave out the boring parts." In old racing history, the boring parts are usually what save the truth. Ethan walked him through everything: the lien auction, the $250, Marisol's paperwork, the 48-hour removal rule, the engine under the tarp, the box of documents, the Polaroids, the dyno sheets, and Vanessa Sterling's lawyer letters. Leonard did not interrupt. He took notes in a narrow black notebook, pausing only when Ethan showed him the receipt beside the hand stamp and the first photo taken before anything had been cleaned. Owen stood near the office door with Hannah's navy cap pulled low, watching the old man study the engine like a doctor studying an injured patient. Leonard finally set his satchel down, put on cotton gloves, and said, "Good, you treated it like evidence, not treasure. That may be why you still own it." For the next hour, Leonard moved slowly around the 1998 Holbrook Corwin HC358 development engine. He did not ask anyone to start it. He did not ask Ethan to turn it over. He used a flashlight, a small inspection mirror, and the kind of patience that made every movement feel official. He checked the crooked hand stamp near the bell housing flange, the bent aluminum tag on the dry sump pan, the dull black coating on the left valve cover, and the strange TIG repair near the water crossover. When he reached that little silver scar, he stopped. He took a Polaroid from Ethan's folder and placed it beside the same area on the real engine. The old photo was grainy, but the repair line had the same curve, the same angle, the same tiny overlap at the end. Leonard looked at Ethan for the first time like he was no longer a stranger. "You recognized this before you had the documents," he said. Ethan wiped his palms on a rag, suddenly aware that Russ and Owen were both holding their breath. "I recognized what it might be," he answered. Leonard gave the smallest smile. Most men would have tried to make it run. "You didn't." Ethan shook his head. "Starting it would have been stupid." Leonard looked back at the engine. "Correct. Collectors will not pay for noise. Not with this, they will pay for proof." Then he opened his satchel and removed 3 printed archive pages from the Hallbrook-Corwin Apex GT development program. On the 3rd page was a list of development units. D1 had been destroyed during testing. D2 was in a private collection in Ohio. D3 was marked as missing after the program shut down. Leonard tapped the line with one gloved finger. This is the missing unit. Or close enough that anyone who wants to challenge it will need better evidence than a rich woman's embarrassment. Russ Danner let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Then caught himself. He had spent the morning expecting trouble. Now trouble had walked in wearing reading glasses and turned into possibility. "So, what is it worth?" Russ asked. Because shop owners, unlike historians, still had bills. Leonard did not answer right away. He gathered the dyno sheets, checked 2 serial notations, and compared them with the hand stamp again. "Unverified," he said, "maybe a few thousand to the right engine collector. Verified with chain of custody, archive match, and these papers, it becomes a missing piece of a failed but famous program. The people who care about that are few, but they care deeply." He looked at Owen, then softened his voice. "Collectors are not paying for polish. They are paying for provenance." By noon, Vanessa Sterling knew Leonard Pike was at Danner's Auto Repair. Ethan never learned whether her assistant saw the pickup, whether someone at the storage facility talked, or whether Vanessa simply had enough people watching every loose thread. The next letter came by email and courier at the same time. This one did not only question the lien sale. It claimed Sterling Heritage Motor Group had prior interest in certain automotive artifacts connected to the estate of Ray Dunleavy and requested immediate access for inspection by a Sterling-approved appraiser. It also warned Russ Danner that storing high-value disputed motorsport property might expose his garage to liability. Russ read the letter twice and went pale around the mouth. "I need this out of here," he said quietly. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I believe you, but belief doesn't pay lawyers." Leonard folded the letter and placed it on the workbench as if it were another piece of evidence. "Do not move the engine without documentation," he said. "Do not let Sterling's appraiser touch it alone and call the storage manager." Ethan called Marisol on speaker. She answered from the facility office. Voice tight but steady. "I was expecting this," she said. "Their lawyer called me too. I have the lien packet, the certified notices, the payment record, the bidder sheet, and the video from the auction lane. Mr. Cole bought Unit B41 legally." Leonard asked if she would be willing to state that in writing and, if necessary, in front of witnesses. There was a pause. Then Marisol said, "I watched that woman laugh at his son. Yes, I'll state it. That was the first witness switch." Vanessa had treated Marisol like a clerk who would bend under pressure instead. The storage manager became the person who could prove the beginning of the chain. Leonard made 2 phone calls after that. The first was to a representative at Harrington Motor Archive, a private collection known for preserving development artifacts from failed American racing programs. The second was to Julian Frost, a board liaison at Sterling Heritage, who had once worked with Leonard on a museum acquisition and cared more about liability than Vanessa's pride. Leonard spoke carefully, never raising his voice. "There is a disputed object," he said. "There is a public humiliation attached to it. There may also be an attempt by your CEO to create a paper dispute after a legal sale, if Sterling wants to challenge. They should do it in a room with witnesses." The room with witnesses happened 2 days later in a private collector preview space behind a glass-fronted showroom in Scottsdale. Ethan almost refused to go. The building was too clean, the floors too polished, the lighting too expensive. It felt like the kind of place where men like him were allowed through side doors only if they carried tools. Leonard would not allow that. "You found it," he said. "You protected it. You will stand beside it." Ethan signed a temporary display and inspection agreement before the engine left Russ's garage. Written by a neutral attorney, Leonard recommended. The agreement stated that the engine remained Ethan's property, that no one could start, disassemble, or alter it. That all inspections would be visual and documentary, unless Ethan gave written permission, and that transportation liability rested with the insured carrier. Russ read the agreement and finally let the engine leave his shop without looking like he had betrayed a friend. Owen came with them because Ethan had promised never to hide the hard parts from him again. The boy wore Hannah's navy cap, the checkered patch tucked just beneath the brim, and stayed close to Ethan as the engine was rolled into the preview room on a low stand. under the clean lights. It looked even rougher than it had at Danner's. Dust still lived in the corners. The black valve cover still peeled. The bent aluminum tag still looked like something a careless person might throw away. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes later in a charcoal suit with 2 attorneys, an appraiser, and the sharp smile of someone who believed presentation could defeat truth. "Mr. Cole," she said, loud enough for collectors near the coffee table to hear, "I see you brought your storage unit souvenir." Ethan did not answer. That bothered her more than any insult would have. Vanessa turned to the room. "Sterling Heritage respects motorsport history. What we do not respect is speculation inflated by people who do not understand provenance. This engine is incomplete, improperly stored, and tied to a questionable storage sale." Her appraiser, a polished man with silver cufflinks, stepped forward and began pointing out missing fittings, cracked hoses, and surface corrosion, as if Ethan had ever claimed the engine was ready for a race. Leonard let him finish. That was Leonard's way. He allowed arrogance to use up all its air before opening a window. When the appraiser said, "There is no reliable proof that this is the D3 development unit," Leonard finally moved. He placed Ethan S. auction receipt on the table first, then Marisol S. signed statement, then the lien packet, then the first untouched photo from the storage unit, showing the engine under the tarp before removal, then the dyno sheets, then the Polaroids. The room, which had been politely murmuring, began to quiet. Julian Frost stood in the back, arms folded, reading each page as it appeared. Vanessa S. smile tightened. "Paper can be misunderstood," she said. Leonard nodded. "That is why we also have metal." He asked the lights to be lowered over the rest of the room and brightened over the engine. Then he turned to Ethan. "Show them what you saw first." Ethan hesitated. He was comfortable under a car, not in front of collectors, attorneys, and executives. Owen looked up at him from under the navy brim, and Ethan remembered the storage lane. The laughter, the question that had hurt more than any insult. Did we just buy trash? He stepped forward and placed one hand near the bell housing flange, not touching the stamp yet. "Most people looked at the engine and saw what was missing," he said. "I looked at what was still there." He wiped a small line of dust away and exposed the uneven HC358D3 stamp. These were not production marks. They were hand stamps used inside the development program. But the stamp alone is not enough. He moved to the water crossover and pointed to the small TIG repair. "This is what made me stop. It is not pretty, but it is specific. The welder overlapped the bead here, then cut heat early here. I saw that pattern years ago in a dyno photo when I worked around these programs. I did not restore it. I recognized it." Leonard placed the old Polaroid beside the live engine under a document camera, and the image appeared on a screen at the front of the room. The same repair, the same curve, the same overlap. Then Leonard added the dyno sheet with the matching D3 notation and the archive inventory page marking D3 as missing. The room went silent. Not politely silent, not waiting for a speech silent, but the kind of silence that falls when pride runs out of places to stand. Owen understood the silence before he understood the value. He looked around and saw adults in expensive watches staring at his father differently. Not kindly exactly, not yet, but with attention, real attention. Vanessa saw it too, and for the first time since the storage auction. She lost control of the shape of the room. Her appraiser leaned closer to the screen, then looked down at his own notes, as if they had betrayed him. Julian Frost stepped forward. "Leonard," he said, "in your professional opinion, is this consistent with the missing Holbrook Corwin D3 development engine?" Leonard did not embellish. "Yes," he said, with the documentation presented. "The chain of custody from the lien sale and the physical markers visible here, I would certify it as the missing 1998 Holbrook Corwin HC358D3 development engine, pending final archive filing." A woman from Harrington Motor Archive, who had been quiet near the back, asked for permission to approach. Her name was Elise Harrington, and she spoke like someone used to buying history without begging for it. She examined the documents, asked Leonard 3 questions, asked Ethan 2, and then turned to her assistant. "Prepare a written acquisition offer," she said. Vanessa immediately stepped in. "Sterling Heritage can make a competitive offer once ownership concerns are resolved." Marisol, who had been standing near the door in her yellow vest because she had come directly from work, lifted the lien packet. "There are no ownership concerns from the facility," she said. "Mr. Cole bought the unit legally. I have the bidder sheet and payment record here." Vanessa looked at her as if noticing her for the first time. That was another mistake. Elise Harrington's written offer arrived 20 minutes later, $950,000 for the engine, paperwork, photographs, and associated development documents. Contingent on final certification by Leonard Pike and transfer through a neutral escrow attorney. There was also a separate one-year consulting agreement offering Ethan $120,000 to assist Harrington Motor Archive in reviewing unidentified motorsport artifacts connected to former development programs. The agreement included defined hours, liability protection, travel reimbursement, and permission for Ethan to decline work that interfered with his son's schedule. Ethan read the number twice and still did not move. Owen tugged lightly at his sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "is that good?" Ethan swallowed. "Yeah," he said. "That's good." Vanessa tried one last move because people like Vanessa often mistake losing for a negotiation they have not finished yet. She approached Ethan with a softer voice, the one executives use when they want witnesses to remember them as reasonable. "Mr. Cole, Sterling Heritage is prepared to exceed that offer if you agree not to make public statements about the auction incident." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He thought of the clip online. The caption, the customers laughing at the garage, Owen holding Hannah's cap in both hands. Then he looked at Julian Frost. "I didn't need to make statements," Ethan said. "Your company already did." Julian's face hardened, not at Ethan, but at Vanessa. The consequence came without shouting. Julian requested a recess, made 3 calls, and returned with the controlled expression of a man carrying bad news that had already been approved by people above the room. Sterling Heritage Motor Group would issue a public correction by the end of the day acknowledging that Ethan Cole had legally purchased Unit B41 and that the company's social media post had been inappropriate. Vanessa's authority over the Sterling Heritage Collector Brokerage Division would be suspended pending internal review. A pending partnership between Sterling and Harrington Motor Archive would be frozen indefinitely. Vanessa stared at Julian as if he had switched sides. He had not. He had simply moved to the side where the paperwork was cleaner. Ethan signed nothing that afternoon until a neutral attorney reviewed every page. Leonard insisted on that. Elise Harrington respected it. The escrow process would take days, the final certification a little longer, but the truth had already crossed the room and changed its temperature. Before they left, Leonard handed Ethan a copy of the archive page with D3 marked in red as found. "You did well," he said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I got lucky at an auction." Leonard looked at Owen, then back at Ethan. Luck opens doors. Skill recognizes what is inside them. It was the kind of compliment Ethan would have rejected if Owen had not been standing there to hear it. The public correction appeared that evening. It was clean, corporate, and not nearly as human as the damage had been, but it existed. The mocking clip disappeared from Sterling Heritage's page. In its place was a statement acknowledging that Ethan Cole was the lawful purchaser of the storage unit, and that comments made at the auction did not reflect the company's stated values. People who had joked under the first post now argued under the correction. Some apologized. Some pretended they had known there was more to the story. Ethan did not read most of it. He sat at his kitchen table with Owen, a stack of legal documents, 2 bowls of soup, and the old Navy cap resting between them like a small flag from a life that had once been easier. A week later, after escrow opened and the consulting agreement was signed, Ethan took Owen to a small brick workshop on the quieter side of town. It had 2 bays, an office with a window, and a faded sign from the previous owner that would need to come down. It was not fancy, the floor had cracks, the lights flickered once when Ethan turned them on, but the roof was solid. The lease had an option to buy, and the school bus stopped 3 blocks away. Owen walked inside slowly, his sneakers squeaking on the concrete. "Is this ours?" he asked. Ethan looked around at the empty bays and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in years. "Not all at once," he said, "but it will be." They named it Cole Heritage Motors. Not because Ethan wanted to sound important, but because Leonard had told him heritage was not only for people with money. Sometimes it belonged to the people who remembered correctly. In the small office, Ethan placed a framed copy of the D3 archive photo on the wall. Then he took Hannah's Navy cap from Owen, brushed dust from the brim with his thumb, and hung it on a peg beside the desk. Owen watched him do it, then shook his head and took it back. "Not yet," he said, putting it on. Mom can look around with me first. Ethan had to turn away for a second because grief did not leave just because money arrived. It only changed rooms. On the first morning they opened the workshop, there were no cameras, no collectors, no CEO in polished heels. Just a father unlocking a door and a boy standing beside him in a faded navy cap with a little checkered patch inside the brim. Owen looked up at the new sign, then at his father. "Dad," he said, when she called it trash, "did you already know?" Ethan pushed the door open and thought about the storage unit, the dust, the stamp, the weld and the silence that had finally taught a room what his son needed to know. "I knew enough to look closer," he said. Owen nodded like that was the answer he wanted. Inside, sunlight stretched across the empty floor. Soon there would be customer cars, invoices, problems, long days, and bills that did not vanish just because one good thing had happened. Ethan knew that. He was still a single father, he still packed lunches, he still checked the thermostat before turning on the heat. He still counted hours and kept promises carefully. But Owen walked into that workshop differently than he had walked into the storage auction. His shoulders were straighter. His hand was not gripping the cap brim anymore. He had seen rich people laugh, and he had seen his father stay quiet. He had seen a room full of experts go silent because that quiet had not been weakness. It had been attention. Years later, people would talk about the forgotten race engine found in a $250 storage unit. Collectors would talk about the missing D3 development engine and the paperwork that saved its history. Sterling S. Board would remember the partnership Vanessa lost because she had turned a bad judgment into a public record. Leonard Pike would file the certification in an archive where the engine finally had its name back. But Owen would remember something simpler. He would remember his father kneeling in dust and while other people laughed. He would remember the old Navy cap on his head and the question he was afraid to ask. And he would remember that his father did not need to shout to prove them wrong. He only looked closer, protected the truth, and let the room discover what he had already seen.